Welcome to Tips and Tools. I'm Dr. Carlos, behavioral psychologist, with my co-host.
I'm Dr. G, clinical psychologist.
And today we're going to be looking at how addiction affects the children in your family and others. We're also going to find out how the children view addicts. So let's get started. So Dr. G,
Yes.
Today we're going to look at something that really is close to my heart because I have two kids.
Great.
And I can't even imagine the amount of pain children will have when they see their parents suffering through addiction.
Yeah.
But the first question I want to ask is, how do children get affected by parents that are addicts?
Well, that's a great question, and I think there's a soft way and there's a harsh way to answer it. Honestly, and I do want to bring that up because on the one hand, I want to have people who are listening and watching our tips and tools segment here to really wake up to the disaster that alcoholism and addiction creates for a family. So on the one hand, I would just in the harsh way but honest way say that it creates addiction, affects the children of and also the whole family in an intensely and extremely detrimental way that I can only equate to a disaster, to a trauma, to extreme hardship, extreme trauma that is not readily recognizable. That's the most...
Which part is not recognizable?
Well, that it is a trauma, that it is a disaster, that it is a catastrophe. That is not readily available or recognizable. So we see the aftermath in a few years or decades, not right away. We look at the family perhaps as even a functional family, a successful family. You see that all the time. To give you an example, I've had one of my clients, and I've seen thousands of people in terms of being clients of mine and having received treatment for addiction or substance use in one way or another. And one family was one of the most successful, if you will, and financially stable and accomplished families in the county. I'm not going to mention which county, but basically in Southern California, that you would have never thought of, that the problem of addiction or substance use exists, first of all, in their family, and to what extreme it has destroyed the entire family.
Oh, wow. What kind of addiction is it? Is it alcohol or?
No, it was actually prescription drug medication. Prescription drug for painkillers, and then antipsychotic drugs, and then anti-anxiety drugs, and so forth and so on. And this is a good example because if you went through the history of this family, starting kind of on the path of addiction, in the beginning everything looked great. There was a little bit of a plastic surgery that led to a lot of good outcome for one member of the family. But then the ensuing problems after that were mostly medically oriented, they also led to this high and heavy reliance on prescription painkillers that then led to other types of abuse. And because it lasted almost 25 years, 25 years, and it didn't really end, and it actually ended quite badly for everybody, because the person who is the subject person, let's say, of this family is now almost permanently hospitalized. The two kids are completely distraught. They are in their early 20s, 20 and 21. They really don't see any future for themselves. I mean, they have financially, materialistically, they have everything. But in terms of psychologically, mentally, socially, family-wise, if you will, the notion of having an intact family, they have lost it.
So that's interesting. We've talked about that before. Addiction doesn't seem to have, it's not prejudice at all towards a socioeconomic status.
It doesn't. And that's the saddest part if you think about it, that because the problem of addiction remained undetected for 20 plus years. I mean, not completely undetected. You would have seen the family saw things happening and the detriment and deterioration happening over, let's say, after the first 5 years, and then the second 5 years was even worse, and then the third 5 years is even worse than that. But what they didn't really know is the extent of the damage that this high reliance of on substances can do to the psyche of the family, to the psyche of the individuals involved, to the point where basically a young woman or man in the family in their 20s ends up having absolutely no hope and no purpose and no motivation for their future, despite everything being kind of available for them, right? To think about it, like a 20-year-old with who is financially stable and doesn't have to work, he could accomplish a lot, right? He could go to an Ivy League school. They were intelligent kids, actually. So they would have otherwise everything available for them if it wasn't for this, let's say, notion of failure, right, within their mindset, failure of family. Their family had failed. They had failed in being a good son or a good daughter.
You mean the children took the blame upon themselves?
Absolutely. And part of it, that not the whole blame. They knew that the mother or the father were also to be held accountable. But that's what happens with a lot of children who grow up in alcoholic or addicted families, that they do bear some blame, take some blame on themselves and have to kind of live with it, even though it is irrational.
There's a lot of irrational stuff. And I also want to do a couple of things with you. Is one, go through different age groups in a sense, and how it affects them differently. For instance, how a 2 or 4-year-old could be affected differently compared to a 10-year-old or an adolescent.
Sure.
But another question is it easier for prescription drug addiction, like you were mentioning here, for this family, is it easier for them to rationalize to their children, I have to take this because I have pain.
Yeah.
I have to take this because of my condition. So they can kind of mask it. Is that why it could have gone 20 years without them realizing it? Or is it just a lack of knowledge on the kid's part, understanding what an addiction really is? What do you think?
Well, what happens is really with families that are kind of ensnared into the cycle of addiction, that nobody intends to become an addict. Nobody, no family and no individual, purposefully plans a horrendous future for themselves. Nobody does. Nobody goes and says, oh yeah, it's one of the worst ways of living in this world, so I'm going to choose that. Nobody does. So we know that part of it has to do with what you mentioned, these kind of rationalizations or seemingly plausible reasons, which ultimately over time become excuses, good excuses, such as, well, I had a surgery, so what do I do with pain? I have to somehow get rid of that pain. And by the way, it is something that is sanctioned by the whole medical community and society. When you go to the hospital, one of the main things that they check with you on a daily basis is how much pain you have. They even have these smiley faces, plastered on the wall. And based on the level of pain, there is this trend of let's say, rationality and reasonableness that has been infused in everyone, in the medical staff, that we are allowed to medicate people. And not only that we are allowed to, but also we should medicate people for pain if they are in pain. So, and the focus is on medication. The focus is not, well, we should reduce pain. That's just human nature. Nobody likes pain. Nobody wants pain. And there is a tendency, let's say, even from an empathic perspective, a doctor wanting to reduce pain in a patient, which is fine with that. But the sole focus on medication-oriented, medication-focused pain reduction then leads the entire staff, if you will, on this trajectory of always medicating people and medicating rather than suggesting other alternative methods, which is changing. We see, for instance, that physical therapy or an urge to start physical therapy earlier rather than later is picking up in hospitals. It used to be people were left alone, let's say in their bed with pain medication for weeks, if not months. But nowadays, right after surgery, probably, I don't know, within 12 hours to 24 hours, they try to get the patient more or less active, right? And that's part of the physical therapy. So the trend is changing. But then going back to the notion of this focus on pain has been heavily rooted in our culture, in our understanding of how we go about our bodies. And therefore, we allow ourselves to use those excuses that, you know what, I had surgery, I'm in pain, my doctor prescribed it, everybody knows and agrees that I should reduce pain, therefore I'm entitled, and everybody should understand me that I'm entitled to this pain reduction, right? So there's this, it's a slippery slope, and there is this justification, the rationalized justification based on common sense or common knowledge. However, there is no end line to that game. That's the problem with addiction, right? If a person becomes highly dependent on painkillers, how can they wean off of it? How can they stop themselves? And in fact, the more painkillers you take, actually, some studies have shown that it really kind of has a reverse effect, that over a long period of time, the more pain you will feel rather than less pain you will feel. Yes, because it really is a systemic problem. You know, the more substances we infuse into our bodies, the more we are messing up with the body's natural tendency of healing, which requires some kind of a natural pain management, unmedicated pain management, for the body to kind of, for instance, tolerance to pain, increase tolerance to pain. But if we are medicating ourselves, we're not working on that ability, if you will, to increase tolerance to pain, right? Because we are numbing the tolerance, we're numbing that ability. We're basically telling that part of our system, our body, don't worry about it. You don't have to work. You don't have to care about the body, because we're just medicating the body, right? So ultimately, this type of an attitude, if a person brings into their home environment and then their children around, there's many problems with that. I mean, this is a very complex topic that we can talk about, but a few things would be, number one, the role model, right? The lesson we are giving our children is to follow that protocol. If you are in pain, take medication rather than do anything else, right? That's number one. That's one big problem.
That's a good point.
The second problem is that over time, kids are very smart. Our children, always the next offspring or generation, is kind of smarter than we are. So they pick up very quickly on the inconsistencies in our stories. For instance, they may see, oh, you know, mom or dad, whoever is the, let's say, addicted person, they went to a party, or they went shopping, or they went to, you know, Las Vegas or gambling, or wherever. They went to the top of a hill or mountain, and they didn't complain of pain at that time, on that day. But now that I'm asking them to sit down with me and do homework, help make my work, suddenly they have pain, right? So they pick up on these inconsistencies, and they detect that there's something else going on than pain. There is this tendency of dependence, high dependence on a substance, or it could be something else. We have talked about there's various forms of addiction.
Yeah.
It could be sex addiction, it could be gambling, it could be, again, prescription meds, or psychotropic medication, etc. So kids pick up on that, and what does that do to their understanding of the role model that they're kind of following every single day? It erodes their trust and their connection, their bond. It really undermines the parents' credibility, and
That's dangerous.
And very dangerous.
Does it change their boundaries too?
It changes boundaries.
Because now they can do this.
There's no question about that.
I can do that if my dad does this or mom does that.
And the fact that now, because of all these stories that people have to tell themselves, they will end up fabricating a lot of, let's say, new rules that only apply to them. So we create double and triple standards within the same family. So in reality, what this whole addiction problem does to the family, it messes up with the entire system, with the entire structure of the family, the boundaries for sure, the hierarchy, the power positions, as we mentioned, trust and credibility, the levels of, if you will, intimacy and closeness between individuals.
Anything in regards to self-esteem?
For sure, because again, these questions you have are like huge
Complex.
questions, so complex. We would be able to spend hours on just talking about like self-esteem, but certainly depends on the age of a child. But if you think about it, in the earlier stages of developmental growth with children who are in their infancy or toddlerhood or basically like let's say elementary years of education and school.
What happens there?
Well, they are going through what we call developmental stages of growth. And when we are talking about these stages, as you can imagine, a child is going through growth mostly based on physical characteristics because they're small and then they get bigger, right?
Sure.
But then what we don't see is what's happening in their brain. We don't see the developmental stages of cognitive development, of emotional development, of identity formation, of esteem and confidence, self-esteem and confidence, of motivation, of emotional regulation, of behavioral, interpersonal effectiveness. None of those are visible to us, right? First, it's not visible. It can be inferred through actions or certain decisions that an individual makes. But it's not a physical characteristic that can be immediately discerned, right? But those are certainly characteristics of personality and ability in a person that are going through different developmental stages, and each stage can be can turn out either in a positive or a negative way, in a detrimental or constructive outcome.
Interesting. So even from the age of 1 to 5, there's subtle things that we don't know
Right.
as being affected. The child's being affected by the parent who is an addict,
Right.
either because of lack of attention,
Right.
Not being there for them, providing a secure base.
Right.
I know there's a philosophy out there, the theory, Erickson's 8 stages, we know that.
Right.
So it does affect those areas, right? It affects the area of autonomy, affects the area of trust and mistrust and all that stuff.
Absolutely. And it's more than a theory. Erickson's psychosocial stages of development is more or less based on observation. And all mothers and fathers can really attest to that observation because they see that in their own children. And like you mentioned, at different stages, like we have the notion of autonomy, ability to explore the world independently, trusting oneself and trusting one's environment and other people in that environment. Notion of initiating certain things, which again has to do with confidence. If we are confident, then we are willing to initiate. The notion of really feeling comfortable within our own skin and being self-differentiated. That means that we would be happy being ourselves and doing the things that we find is functional without depending on other people's approval or reactions, which at times could lead to a lot of feelings of shame or guilt or disappointment or loneliness or hopelessness or helplessness. So those are characteristics of human functioning that form within those developmental stages, especially during birth and about, prior to puberty, I would say, by 10, 11, 12 years of age. We have kind of a foundational set of personality and characteristics that lead us through the rest of our lives. And that has all been formed during those formidable ages.
So all our personality traits, the way we handle things, the way we perceive life is based upon that.
Based upon that. And now if you are growing up with an alcoholic father or alcoholic mother or addicted a parent who displays lack of reliability and trust, a lot of manipulative strategies in their interpersonal interactions with other people. Again, a lot of justification, sense of entitlement, a lot of lying and cheating and really
This is from the
perhaps
child?
even stealing. No, that's from the addict.
Oh, the addict.
Whoever the addict is. It could be a brother, could be a uncle, it could be a father or a mother. All these dysfunctional characteristics are associated with an addict because they have to maintain their addiction. Therefore, they go through the extreme lengths, if you will, of getting whatever they need to get in order to maintain that addiction, whether it is money, whether it is manipulating people, whether it is to put themselves in a particularly beneficial situation. And that is regardless of other important values that people may have. Because addicts too are human beings who do have values, but they just completely kind of ignore those values, such as, let's say, moral understanding or standing in the society. For instance, not cheating, not stealing, not manipulating. Even logical understanding, and that's why a lot of times we regard addiction as a disease, because we see that a person may very logically be aware that their decisions lead to negative consequences and hardship and failure and destruction, but they still continue doing it. So it's almost like a faulty logic. Now, it's not faulty personality, faulty person. It's part of a faulty decision making that could also be regarded as, I would say, what the disease model proposes to be, which is the brain is really not working the way it should be. Right?
And we're going to touch upon that.
It has a disease.
Yeah.
It is ill.
Let me ask you this question. You're a clinical psychologist. You've been doing this for years. You're an expert in addiction. Do you see parents who have addiction, do they use that mantra that we've heard before, and I'm sure you've heard it in all your years, where they say, he's young enough, he'll get over it.
Yeah.
They kind of dismiss it. Oh, he's only 5. She can handle it.
Yeah.
And they kind of dismiss their behavior. Because as a parent, being myself a parent, you're as well, everything we do, they watch.
Yes.
And we have to be on guard all the time, in a sense, right? But when you're an addict, like you were saying earlier, your brain's kind of in a disease mode.
Yeah.
It doesn't function properly.
Right.
They're not really self-aware of what they're doing. So they're hurting their kids indirectly either by bad behavior examples, whatever it may be. But then they dismiss it because they're young.
Yeah.
They'll get tough. They'll get tough. They'll be overcome this. In 10 years, they're going to forget about it. But is that true?
Part of it could be true, but I wouldn't rely on it. Okay. In some cases, may be true, but who knows? So there's no scientific evidence, if you will, of proving that approach will work. In fact, if anything, I would suggest that this approach of labeling someone as only going through a transition or through a temporary growth spurt or experimental period where they're dabbling into this and that, but they get over it, that probably is more or less a heuristic that people use, more or less a quick shortcut and decision based on their own experiences. If a father looks at their son or daughter and says, oh, they're kind of messing up in this area, they may kind of remember their own time when they messed up at one point of time, but they got over it. So they're using that as the basis of that shortcut. It's okay, well, because I overcame that, or I read it in the news, or I heard it on the TV, or I saw it in somebody in the family. Therefore, my child should be able to get over it as well. Sometimes we even use the history of our own child. Like, let's say they got over something, they were messing up when they were 5 or 6, like they were throwing temper tantrums, right? But then it was a short period of time. It lasted only 3 months, but they generally got over it. I may use that as an excuse or basis for when my child is 17-year-old and now using drugs. And that's just experimental. They're just have to fit in, but they're going to get over it. Well, that first incidence has nothing to do with this other incidence. They are way apart from each other. They are not linked. They are happening at two different developmental stages, 5 years of age versus 17 years of age. Throwing a temper tantrum is a completely different story than using drugs, right? And then again, once a person starts using drugs, they are destroying their brain mechanisms. And also, it's a biopsychosocial model. It's not just the brain. It's not just the mind. It's also the body as well as their psyche. And if they are destroying part of this system at an early stage, think about everything, all the lessons, all the experiences they're missing out on.
Sure.
Right?
It's a lot.
It's a lot. Instead of being at the 100% of their capacity of learning, they probably are at 50% or 20% of their capacity or ability to learn. So even though the information may be available to them, they may be missing out on that opportunity because the ability and capability is not at its highest level.
Interesting. Now, we have a theory out there. It's called attachment theory.
Yes.
And I want to see if you'd be kind enough to explain briefly what attachment theory is and how did that fit in regards to addiction? Parents who are addicted, do they provide that secure base, or what kind of things can they do to influence that?
I think we need a different segment on attachment theory because it's very well researched and there's a lot of data, a lot of information to be had about it. But very, very briefly, what I could mention is, first of all, there is a distinction between what we call an early attachment style and an adult attachment style. There's not that they are too far apart from one another. Actually, one can predict the other, but that's where the early attachment style can actually predict the adult attachment style of a person, and vice versa. The adult attachment style of a parent can predict the attachment style of their offspring. There's a lot of research that is available that supports this. Now, that's what I'm saying. We really need a different segment. But very quickly, a brief, layout of what attachment style is as far as an adult. Let me just focus on adult attachment style. An adult attachment style is more or less their approach, the kind of a innate, automatic approach toward conflict resolution, toward reducing distress that arises from interpersonal strife, which we see a lot of times being activated between husband and wife, between parents and children, between siblings, between partners, that's whether it is business partner or romantic partner, co-workers, and worker employee or employee and employer type of relationship. And it really can either create really good bonds and relationships and more understanding if people come from a secure attachment. But if it is really anchored in an insecure approach toward that conflict resolution, then it can lead to destructive relationships. It can lead to destructive decision making. It can lead to destructive outcome in terms of, let's say, maybe two partners who came together with great intentions, but ultimately they are incapable of continuing their relationship because they just cannot settle differences. They have two complete different and insecure approaches toward conflict that arises out of their relationship. So we will go into the depth and details in another segment, but very briefly also how it can affect people who are also struggling with addiction is that perhaps, for instance, if a person who is using drugs and they are kind of oblivious and numb to the issues that are going around them because they have taking care of that pressure, or they're taking care of that pain inside by using drugs, right? Now, what they're also oblivious to is these automatic, innate approaches that they usually take toward conflict resolution, because they're just not interested, motivated, or aware of what is happening between two people as these two people are addressing a conflict or a problem with one another, right? So if they were, there would be ability or opportunity to actually address those attachment styles and work on them and change them from insecure to secure, so you could actually rescue the relationship. You could actually come up with really good resolutions to that conflict. But if you're numb internally, psychologically, to everything that's going around you, even though it is doable or feasible, the solution is inside, you wouldn't even see it.
Hi, welcome to Adelante. This is Adelante Recovery, and my name is Yvette Kuglin, and I'm part of the staff.
Adelante Recovery Center has helped people in dual diagnosis for 5 years. We accept most PPO insurances and provide luxury accommodations and 24-hour support. To speak with an admissions counselor, call 1-888-242-4450.
A lot of time we don't even know what's wrong with us, and sometimes we need to get away to figure that out. So if you want to go for a little retreat out in Corona Del Mar, which is a confidential location, we're here to help. So we're only a phone call away. Thank you.
Is there a strong correlation between addicted people, persons, for instance, and insecure attachment? Have you seen that?
There is not necessarily, because the insecure attachment, I mean, in terms of the addiction, certainly there is more addiction, if you will, that happens with people who have insecure attachments rather than secure attachments. This notion of secure attachment by itself indicates a level of psychological development in a person that is on par with someone who is interested in self-care, in independence, in interdependence, in healthy approach toward themselves and others. So if they already have a secure way of dealing with conflict, that means that they have enough internal psychological resources to tap into to remain at a functional state without relying on self-numbing strategies such as substance use. So therefore, you would certainly see a lot less to non-existent addiction in securely attached people. And vice versa, you would definitely see a lot more addictive personalities within the insecurely attached pool of people, right? You would see that. However, I'm personally not privy to that type of, let's say, statistical information. Which one is to what extent, how significant it is, the correlations that we want to talk about. But certainly, in terms of overall health and not just addiction itself, people benefit from switching from insecure attachment styles to secure attachment styles. That can be also, let's say, in let's say, financial realm of functioning, in physical realm of functioning, in emotional realm of functioning. When we have a secure attachment style, we have already transitioned from an unhealthy or less functional, less effective way of dealing with issues to a more healthy, functional, effective ways.
Yeah, that's a good one. It's really amazing, because I have to follow the method to my madness here for a second. So the people who have a secure attachment, they have the resources,
yes,
to be able to handle conflict resolution.
Yeah.
I guess what I'm looking at now is, how does an addict affect their children in regards to that? If they can't provide that secure attachment, in a sense, do they not deny, but do they limit the education of the resources the child has? You know what I mean? Maybe I said that
But it
backwards.
goes beyond that. It's not
beyond
only
that.
they limit the education resource that the child has, but also they really are depriving their children of the very basic foundation in developing some semblance of confidence and self-worth. Because, like you mentioned earlier, if let's say an addictive parent is so preoccupied with their addiction, then how can they be even emotionally, financially, psychologically, or otherwise available to their children when their children are in need? And we know that all children are in dire need for everything every single day, especially the earlier, the more, right? The younger they are, the more needs they have. So if just imagine a father who is addicted, right? They most likely have a very unstable, unreliable, volatile, fluctuating pattern of availability. They someday may not even come home, right? Or they may be found, drunk in a park, or arrested, or in prison, or for whatever the scenario may be. These are very much well established, in terms of research, well established signs and patterns that coincide with addiction. So maybe not in the first few weeks or months, but if a person is really addicted, a father or mother is addicted, ultimately they will go through these stages, if you will, of unavailability. They end up being unavailable to their children at one point or another.
This does not mean unavailable to take them to a soccer game either.
No, it's very good. So it's unavailable physically, which could affect a person's soccer game. They're unavailable emotionally because they're numbing themselves. They're not even available to themselves. How can they be available to other
So
people's
the child has
problems?
something, gets picked on at school, and try to express it to their parent.
They say, "Don't bother me.
Don't bother me.
Don't
Or
bother
they're
me.
kind of like,
I'm
not
busy.
here.
I'm not here. I don't care. Or if I care, I'm just gonna spend 2-3 minutes and tell you to just, shut up, or probably just be done with it. I've talked enough. Or do it, or take it or leave it. Do it, or forget about it. Things like that. You get this type of almost resistant, avoidant, uninterested, unmotivated approaches from the parents, who show basically no genuine interest. And even if they have genuine interest, they lack the skills to communicate this interest in an effective way. Because how effective is it for a father to just say, well, you know what, or a mother, again, I'm not discriminating between parents, whatever gender, but for a parent to say, well, you know what, I'm so interested in your grades. I really want to make sure that you're succeeding in life and in your school, etc. But you know what, don't bother me with it. Just take care of it. It's on you, kid. I'm too busy, right? I'm too busy. I've done enough. I have provided as much as I could. Now this is your problem. How effective is that? This is just telling a person go figure it out without giving them the skills or knowledge to figure it out. So it deteriorates the relationship. It impacts, it destroys the trust. It destroys the bond. It destroys the child's willingness and motivation to come back, because they have been, rejected once or twice or 3 times or many times. They ultimately will give up. It's like, why should I go back to this unavailable person? Whether they're physically unavailable or emotionally, psychologically, financially, family-wise, they're unavailable. So a smart brain, again, children are kind of smart. They pick up on that and they say, well, this is a waste of time. And it may be dangerous, because we know people who are ultimately addicted, they do engage in risky behaviors, right? They may even be completely unaware of their into actions. For instance, they may become violent without wanting to or even noticing that they're becoming violent.
That's interesting, because I know I grew up in a home where my mom had prescription addiction for years, and my father was an alcoholic. And you can see those behaviors in them.
Yeah.
Same thing. They're unavailable. I see it in my daughter when she looks for me to be available.
Yes.
You know, she looks across the room. Papa, look at this. Papa, look at that.
Right.
And I know if I don't,
Uh-huh.
she's going to get hurt.
Yes.
And just like you said earlier, that affects them.
Yeah.
It also, I think, affects their perception of the world
Yes.
in a sense, right? They start viewing people differently. I don't need anybody.
Yeah.
That's what I'm being taught, I guess, indirectly. And I know with my father, if when he was drinking and he was drunk, obviously, and he would pass out, he was unavailable.
It was
I couldn't do anything with him.
Right.
And that affects people, because I looked at it and go, wow, I don't know what's wrong with him. I knew something was wrong as a child.
Yes.
And I guess this leads to my next question. As a child, you look at that and you see it and you're wondering, my dad's on the ground, he's passed out.
Yeah.
Something's not right with this picture. I just don't know what it is.
Yeah.
Do they have an understanding of what is supposed to be right and wrong? Or are they trying to develop and create that, what's right and wrong? You know what I mean? Is it inherent?
It's kind of, again, complex. You love to ask complex questions, but it's one of those complex things that...
He's a man that can answer those questions, that's for sure.
Let me kind of separate it into different scenarios. Well, can they differentiate between right and wrong? To some extent, yes, because... and it depends on the age. If they are 2-year-old, probably not. But if they are maybe about 5 or 6 years old, they have some notion of what is right and wrong. They have learned it from somebody, whether it is the same parents or close family members, or maybe even beginning kindergarten and teachers and schools, or maybe even heard it on cartoons because they're watching cartoons, and there's a lot of socially relative information on cartoons. What's right, what's wrong, and don't do this, you're gonna break your arm, right? Those type of things. So if you think about it, to some extent, depending on the age, yes, they have a notion of right and wrong, but also it is not fully developed. So they're continuing to adapt, adjust, fine-tune their sense of morality, of right and wrong. And certainly it can be affected, and it is affected by their environmental factors, such as a father who has passed out. Now, certainly in addition to that, and that's the complexity of our mind, is like we have layers upon layers upon layers of consciousness, of events that are happening and that are creating experiences that we solidify into some kind of a meaningful level of experience that we also remember down the road. For instance, you may see your dad passed out, and one layer of experience is freaking out. Why is my dad passing out? Isn't that the all-powerful person that I've always known? And why are they completely out? Right? That's a fear that sets in. On top of that, a need to help, because somehow we have also learned, or if somebody falls or passes out or is unresponsive, you care about them. You try to get them to respond to you. You inquire about them. Are they doing okay or not? So there is another layer comes in of wanting to help, which ultimately, if that's one of the paramount characteristics of children who grow up in families with addiction, what we call a parentification process, where the child learns over time that not only they have to take care of themselves, but they actually have to take care of other people as well, almost becoming the parent to other people, whether it is the parent to their own parent, or the parent to their younger siblings, or the parent to a cousin, or whoever that is in need. Because that's what they notice. And if they're smart, actually, if you think about it, to some extent, it can work against them, because a smart person is going to quickly figure things out that, oh, okay, my dad is not available, is passed out, I need breakfast, I better go take care of myself. Oh, there's a younger brother here, let me take care of him as well. Now, subconsciously, I found myself in a parent's role. And then I have to go, kind of wake up that dad, pour some cold water on his face or whatever to take us to school, right?
That's a strange turnaround, too.
Very strange.
And we'll get to that, too, because I know We have a few more minutes, but this is what I wanted to do is try to box it in between what they call the formative years, right? 1 through 6, I think it is. And also, I want to take it back even before the child's born. So we're going to go back. We're going to get rid of the twilight zone and the world of consciousness for a second and go into something. A lot of studies are coming out now that even in the womb, the child can be affected by an addict.
Sure.
What do we know about that?
But certainly on a physiological level, because of some drugs can pass the blood placenta barrier, where basically really the placenta, woman's placenta in the womb is a barrier to a lot of chemicals that blocks all these, let's say, for instance, some antidepressants or anti-anxiety medication or even real drugs from, or just general drugs from entering the womb and the child's bloodstream, but not all of them. So ultimately, that's where you see the fetal alcohol syndrome, or
What's that?
well, that's children who are born to alcoholic mothers, where they have deformations. They have both brain damage as well as facial and body deformations, and they become intellectually disabled. They become emotionally disabled. They have developmental challenges in terms of their physical growth, and again, like I said, facial and body features. So
This is due to excessive alcohol intake
excessive.
for the mom.
That's excessive, and also the earlier the worse, because when mothers abuse drugs in the early stages of pregnancy, that's where the whole neuronal system hasn't even developed yet. It is just developing at a cellular level, which affects everything else from then on. If the alcoholism happens, let's say, in the last couple of months, there's less damage compared to if it is happening in the beginning 2 months. Because it's really, as you know, a child really comes, is developed over time from an embryo into a fetus and gradually into a child form that we would recognize on the ultrasound and so forth. We say, oh yeah, it has all the features and it's kind of a grown, baby that hasn't been born yet, right? Unborn baby, if you will. But it takes that 9 months, and throughout those 9 months, anything external can physiologically affect the growth and development of a child, whether we talked about neuronal level, cognitive level, because certainly brain doesn't just start developing after birth. It has already started from more or less second or third month, right? There's some cells, neuronal stem cells that are developing. So brain functioning can be affected, cardiovascular functioning, neuronal system, the neuronal network, neural pathways, musculature, skeleton, everything, all the organs, everything can be affected on a physiological level. But then in addition to that, too, what can be affected is more or less the brain ability or functioning that later on after birth would be characterized as, let's say, cognitive functioning or attachment or emotional health of a person. Their temperament by itself can be affected. Temperament, that's the genetic...
Even before they come out of the womb.
Yes.
Wow.
But well, it is formed. Again, it's not like... That's the thing. If we really want to understand psychology, we have to go all the way back to this combination of biology and psychology. That's why we have neuropsychology. The neuropsychology is that cross-section. It allows us, or biopsychology, or psychobiology, it allows us to see psychology in conjunction with the body rather than separate from the body, right? So where did the body starts? Where does the body start developing? Not after birth. It has already started before birth, which is in the womb, right? So if you combine these two, and in terms of psychological functioning, for instance, hearing is a psychological functioning. It's a psychobiological functioning. We need the ears, right? The inner ears. We need the whole, auditory system, including brain regions, to be able to hear. Well, they exist before birth.
My wife says I don't have any, but okay.
You may not.
Yes, yes. That's really amazing.
Isn't it?
And then one more question in regards to cocaine.
Yeah.
There have been a lot of studies, I think, with cocaine users that got pregnant. That really affects the child in a very bad way, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. Again, I'm not an expert on, let's say, child development prior to birth or even after birth as it relates to this drug abuse, to the depth of explaining in details what those detrimental factors are, again, in detail. But yes, generally, as I mentioned, whether it's heroin or cocaine or alcohol or methamphetamines, these hardcore drugs, and some prescription medication, including antipsychotic drugs, anti-anxiety drugs.
Really?
Yes, they can, narcotics, narcoleptics, basically kind of sleep medication, painkillers. A lot of these various drugs can certainly cross that placenta blood barrier between the mother and child. When they enter the system, they can affect anything and everything. Now, certainly cocaine is a stimulant, right? It's same thing with methamphetamine. Those are the stimulant category, and what the damage is from that type of category is to some extent similar as well as different to another category. For instance, let's say depressants, right? The alcohol is a depressant, or narcotics such as heroin and morphine and opium and so forth, opiates. So
does it make them more prevalent becoming addicts themselves if their parents, let's say the mother had a drinking problem throughout their birth? Does it make it more likely for them to become an addict or alcoholic later? Do we know?
It depends. I would say certainly there is that predisposition, right? So, but then also it can work the other way around, meaning that it can almost like immunize them, not scientifically. I mean, just I'm kind of talking anecdotally, more or less. Because it really it depends on multiple factors. How does that child grow up, and what is their psychological contribution? If a child is smart enough to kind of make sense and meaning out of that challenge and struggle that they're growing up in, such as the environmental factors, again, going back to the lack of availability of a parent. Let's say they have been, in terms of physiologically, they have been exposed to drugs, right? From even before birth and then after birth, right? Well, it's in their system. Their immune system has dealt with it. Their DNA is kind of responding to it. But that's not the whole picture. What about the environmental factors? What about the influence of other family members who are not addicted? What about the influence from peers? What about the education they're getting at the school? What about their personal choice? How to deal with pressure, pain, unavailability, lack of trust, attachment, things like that. So it's very hard to say that for sure, like which way it will turn out to be. And in no matter what research we do, there's always that rule of the rule of the third that you always find. There's no research that finds 100% guaranteed outcome with whatever it is being researched. You find 1/3 of the population that is kind of complying and is aligned with the expected hypotheses. That 1/3 that is completely contrary to what you thought, and the other third that is kind of has a placebo effect, is not affected by this whole thing either way. So it is hard to say, but certainly even a physical deformation is not a good thing to have, let alone a cognitive or emotional deficit for a child that has grown up and been exposed to alcohol or any of these drugs pre-birth. It's not going to be a pleasant ride in life.
No, it won't be.
Right.
And that's the great thing. We covered a lot. We covered from when the child's in the womb,
Yes.
all the way till about 6 to 8.
Yes.
And then we're going to go on further in the other shows and talk about adolescence and how it affects that, how it affects peer pressure. We'll talk about that. And you made a great point about the media. A lot of times they'll use a study and they'll imply that it is 100%, right? This leads to this. And you and I both know a lot of studies usually frown upon any kind of causal relationship.
Yes.
They're usually more of a correlational thing, and basically what it means is nothing really causes or cause and effect. It's really hard to pinpoint that.
Yes.
There's too many variables.
But they're related, like
They're
this
related.
correlation. Let me ask you something, Dr. Carlos.
This is the dangerous part of the show. Yes,
That's
sir.
the dangerous part, because first of all, before I ask you a question, I want to ask our viewers to, if you have further questions, feel free to reach out to us. You can reach out via therapy cable, and also you can call our one of our sponsors, Elite Care Treatment, in terms of substance use, addiction, and treatment. Their phone number is 888-511-0607, or go to elitecaretreatment.com for further questions. And the other thing I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned the upbringing that you had,
Oh, yes.
particularly. So that's, I think, a very interesting moment that we can take from a person like yourself who has been through this, because you asked me these questions, and I'm kind of coming from research, from empirical, from evidence-based, as well as anecdotal and experience. But how about you? You yourself were exposed to this type of environment. How do you think you were able to kind of turn this thing around in your life and come out more victoriously rather than succumb to that type of an environment?
It's kind of funny because you mentioned alcoholism earlier, and my brother and I both took the different route.
Yeah.
We actually went the opposite way of my father because we noticed everything we were deprived of.
Okay.
As you said, availability.
Yeah.
We noticed the temper.
Yeah.
We noticed a lot of behaviors that weren't good, and neither one of us wanted that. We didn't like the effects of alcohol, so we kind of steered away from it.
Okay.
I think I had my first drink of alcohol when I was 29. Some people say, "Oh, wow, you really avoided it." It was many years avoiding it, but I think it was a good thing for me. My mother was an addict for a while in regards to prescription drugs. She overcame that after years, but she eventually did. I was too young to really understand it, but I remember when I was, I think it was 7 or 8, and she was completely medicated and passed out on the sofa. And I remember her telling me, "Thank you for helping me." And I had this really weird sensation in my body feeling, wait a minute, it's not really my role. I want to help her. And we know a lot of children always play doctor and they pretend to help.
Yeah.
But this is beyond pretending. And even as a 7 or 8 year old, I could distinguish that, and I realized it was just kind of something was wrong in that world. But one of the things that really helped me overcome it, which I always tell students that I teach or other people that I talk to, is looking at your parents as human beings and not just as your parent. And as you noticed or mentioned earlier, a lot of times we view our parents as superheroes in a sense, right? They're immortal. Nothing goes wrong. They can protect us. When in reality, they go through a lot of the same challenges we do. They have they've had challenges in their life and struggles just like my father.
Right.
My father left Cuba when the communism came, and he went and was homeless for 6 months with my brother and my wife and my mom. So the whole family was homeless for 6 months, and here's a 23-year-old man who lost his father 3 years before that. So when I started looking at these little pieces of his life, I realized, wow, look at everything he went through.
Yes.
Did he have the resources? He might have, but obviously not, because he chose the alcohol. Or maybe that's what he was most attuned to at the time. I don't know. But I saw him in a different light. And I think it really behooves us a lot of times to look at our parents, if you have a parent who's an addict, is to look at where they came from.
Yeah.
What were their parents like? Because he lost his father when he was about 15.
Yeah.
And obviously what people don't see then is the mom.
Yeah.
Well, the mom lost the husband. So she's not all available, as you say, to him, because she's preoccupied with the loss of her husband. So she's not all available to the child. Yeah. And those are all these factors that I started learning. And that was really made a difference for me, because I realized he's a human being just like I am.
Fantastic. I would like to add to that for our viewers that, a lot of times the problem I see with addicts is the kind of unending sense of entitlement, really, and that entitlement ties into what Dr. Carlos was talking about, in the sense that we are still entitled to receive, we are still entitled to be instructed, we are still entitled to be protected, to be given things, to be guided, and so forth. So it's a lot of passivity a lot of sense of expectation that somebody should take care of us, or somebody should do something for us, or somebody should have shown us a way or guided us in a different direction. And I think that generally, legally, that ends at 18, because when you're 18 years of age, you're regarded as an adult. Sometimes it's 21 when it comes, for instance, to certain things like drinking or buying cigarettes. Sometimes it's 25, for instance, renting a rental car and things like that. But generally, legally, anywhere between 18 and 25, that sense of entitlement should have ended. But I think I want to go even earlier than that. I think our sense of entitlement should end as soon as we become curious enough to find faults with others. As soon as we find out that my dad or my mom has not provided what I'm expecting to, I have the intelligence, apparently, to do something about it. And if you have the intelligence to do something about what you find faulty, you're already an adult in terms of a cognitive functioning. And hopefully it is after 15 or 16 years of age. And the reason I say that is because developmentally, again, according to Piaget's cognitive developmental stages, the brain doesn't develop the ability of what we call a formal functioning or abstract thinking, and also according to moral developmental stages, moral reasoning up until about age of 16. So I would say if you are 16, 17 and higher, then you really want to follow what Dr. Carlos was suggesting, that you look at your parents, if you have an addicted parent, as human beings rather than somebody who should provide something for you. And just look at perhaps their history. In fact, that's something I would go to. Where did they grow up? What challenges did they have? What difficulties did they grow up with? What obstacles had they to overcome? And if you really kind of just ask yourself, ask them, tell me more about where you grew up, what your family was like, what your wishes were, what unfulfilled wishes are still, and what's your self-esteem like, what's your self-confidence, how do you view yourself, what do you see as limitations, what do you see as your strengths and weaknesses. The more you ask these questions, the more you get to know that person as a person rather than somebody who should provide something to you and for you.
Great point.
So
thank you, sir. It was a fabulous show.
Yes, it was. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Fantastic questions and answers. And thank you for sharing your personal experience. I really appreciate that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Tips and tools. We'll catch you next time.